Hi, everyone. Hey. Yeah, last session of the day, and then we get to get drinks. Come on, no one's excited about that, all right? You guys get to go home and sleep, or go get a spray tan in one of those rooms, where they're giving out spray tans. We can do that. So today, I'm going to talk to you about RESTful APIs. Super exciting stuff, I know. My wife came for this because she's so excited about REST APIs. See? She's super excited. First off, let's thank our sponsors, TVA, all the big names here. Without them, we would be in a very small building somewhere. We wouldn't have snacks, because 2 years ago we didn't have snacks. So big shout out to all of them, particularly the Chamber and Chatec. I'm in the Business Development Center downtown. The Chamber's a big partner with them. So a lot of what I'm doing is because of them. So let's go into it. So about me, been married to my best friend for almost 16 years. She probably didn't know that was going to be in there. I've got 3 awesome children, 6, 3, and 1 as of this week. Been in Chattanooga for 10 years. The developer community here in Chattanooga has been great historically. That's where I've met all of my best friends here in town. They've been very welcoming to me. Didn't know we had gigabyte internet till after I moved here. That was a surprise. I liked it. I've got a bachelor's in web design and development from Full Sail. An actual degree in web design and development. Think about that. That's a weird one. Most everyone has computer science or anything but web. Professionally, I've been in web development for about 16 years. I spent over a decade kind of in the WordPress ecosystem. I built a SaaS on top of WordPress that I later sold. And from there, I kind of transitioned out of developing for 3 years. I really didn't touch any code at all. I sold the company. I went into doing product design, product management, product ownership, discovery, all of those sorts of things. I've always kind of been in between a designer and a developer. Not a great designer and not a great developer, but I could make the thing look like the thing in the browser. And we all know the programmers that can't make the thing look like the thing. They're like, it looks like it. You're like, that doesn't look like it. I've always kind of been right there in the middle. I've got a lot of agency experience and worked with some SaaS companies here in town as a full-time employee. So I've got a pretty varied background. If you need your product design in Figma, I can do that. If you need your API built, if you need to deploy to AWS, I can do those things as well. I'm not an expert at any of it. So I'm very qualified to give this talk. Currently, I'm an independent consultant. I have clients ranging from I consult their design team to I'm head of product for a client to I built the whole application and launched it. So it's all over the place. I've only been building APIs for about 16 months. Before that, I was in the WordPress world. You didn't really need to know the API. So this is all pretty new to me, which is why I'm kind of talking about it. So a year and a half ago, I restarted my own company because my wife actually started it. She wanted me to have a better work-life balance. So start your own company, right? That's the plan. And it worked. We have a much better work-life balance. But I hadn't developed in 3 years. And my first project was a full-stack JavaScript project with a Vue front end on AWS in the cloud. I didn't know what Lambda meant. I thought that's just a math or like a sorority thing. Had no idea. So I got into that project, and the other developer expected about 2 months in, I might get into the Lambdas and start looking at the APIs and the database. And I think it was about 3 weeks. I was like, all right, I'm ready to not be waiting on you to do other stuff. I want to contribute higher. So I dove right into it, but I had to learn everything from the ground up. And I had no idea what I was doing. I was building REST APIs. I didn't know what that meant. Literally, I didn't know what the acronym was or anything about it. So I went down the rabbit hole of the internet about REST APIs. What is a RESTful API? What are the best practices? How do I implement it appropriately into my project, my tech stack? And as you can imagine, that went pretty deep. And I came across this guy. Besides you, raise your hand if you know who this guy is. Anyone know who this guy is? This is Roy Fielding, the creator of the RESTful API. He wrote a dissertation in 2000 for his doctorate where in chapter 5 is where he explained and described representational state transfer. And that's when it was really born. And that was not the main topic of his paper by any means, but it stuck because we needed this new model to get out of RPC. So he created the REST API. And so what I want to do now is kind of walk through some definitions, and so we can really understand exactly what it is by his definition. And then we're going to look at some VS Code stuff and kind of compare what we may today expect as a response for an entity in a payload, and how maybe we can transform that to make it more correct to this definition. And as everything in tech, there's no true hard rules or lines on these things. Every team is different, every situation is different. It's not a silver bullet for everything. But as I dove into it further, I really realized there's kind of one key principle that most REST APIs miss, and it seems really important. And I know it's really important to Roy, and we'll see a statement that he has on that. It has 6 core constraints. The first one is the client server, to promote separation of concerns and allow each to evolve independently. Directly from his dissertation, by separating the user interface concerns from the data storage concerns, we improve the portability of the user interface across multiple platforms and improve scalability by simplifying the server components. I think for the most part, that's probably our goal when we're building stuff, right? That's what we think we're doing. We're separating these things. But then we also know that the minute, an entity name changes or URL changes, oh God, everything's coupled. We got to go in and go change it here, change it there. So that's the first constraint. The second one is that it's stateless. The server shouldn't need to store contextual information to process the request. Basically, everything that you send in that response or that request, it should give all the information that the server needs to fulfill it. I think aside from that payload, the body of that request, you would obviously have your authentication if you're in an authenticated system, your JWT, anything like that. The third constraint is that it should be cacheable, and the response should clearly communicate if this response is cacheable or not. Explicitly putting that in the headers and having that in the agreement between your server and your client. This is all pretty straightforward so far, right? This is all pretty common stuff. The uniform interface. And this is the one that we're going to take a deeper dive in a second, because this is where kind of all the magic happens for the bulk of us as developers. A consistent, standardized way for clients to interface with resources. Consistency in your API. And we're going to dive into that one much deeper here in a second, so we'll just kind of go past that for a second. Layered system. The client should have no concern about the server systems or the architecture. It gives you flexibility on how to deploy. The client shouldn't care if it's pointing to an API gateway, a PHP server. The client really shouldn't care. It just needs to know the URL and, like I said, have your authentication if applicable. And then the sixth constraint is code on demand. Server response contains a piece of executable code that the client can run. I'm glad he put optional on this one, because this is before my development days, but my understanding is more of the Java, applet space where it's oh, we're just going to send you the code and now just execute it. So this is not really one that I've even really seen any examples in my research. Not everything ages well. So let's dive into the uniform interface. It's identification. So here's the 4 key parts. The identification of resources in request. So when I say resource in the context of a RESTful API, accounts would be a resource that you are targeting in your endpoint. Invoices would be a resource. The UUID of that resource, this is how you define what resource we want to interact with, whether that's a get or a delete or a post. The second main part of it is the manipulation of resources through representations. The client should be able to manipulate the response and return it as is. That's just a bunch of words. I think a good way to think of that is in your service layer, if you are aggregating data from different entities and putting it together for this response, when you give that response to the client in that much more simplified format, the client should be able to manipulate the data in that format and provide it back to the service. It's on the service's it's the service's responsibility to then kind of untangle it and send it to the other entities and de-aggregate it. That's not a word. And send it where it needs to go. It needs to have self-descriptive messages. Should contain all of the information needed from the server to process the request. Part of that is this a post? Is this a get? Is this a put? Is this a delete? Is it a patch? You would have your URI, which would be where you identify the resources that you're touching. And then if it's a post, you would obviously have a payload. If it's a get, you wouldn't have a payload. And the fourth one is hypertext as the engine of application state. That's the one that I think is most intriguing, and that's the acronym for that is HATEos, and that's where the hateful comes in the title of this talk. HATEos, HateOS. I like HATEos. We can just say however we want because there's no definition of it. But the client based only on one initial URI, think of the root, the apex of the endpoint or the domain, should be able to find out on its own all of the various actions it can do on the server. That's an interesting one. That's interesting. So we're gonna dive into that a little bit here more in a second. But we don't want to upset Roy. And so the dissertation in 2000 defined the RESTful API, and in 2008, I think he had enough. So this is directly from his blog post, specifically talking about RESTful APIs 8 years later. What needs to be done to make the REST architectural style clear on the notion that hypertext is a constraint? In other words, if the engine of application state, and hence the API, is not being driven by hypertext, then it cannot be RESTful, and it cannot be a REST API, period. Is there some broken manual somewhere that needs to be fixed? I don't know Roy, but he seemed a little annoyed when he wrote that response in the blog post. And it makes sense once you kind of start to understand what the hypermedia as the engine of application state means from his paper. That post was on October 20th, 2008. 1 month to the day, November 20th, 2008, Leonard Richardson presented what's now called the Richardson Maturity Model for REST APIs at a conference, QCon, in San Francisco. He kind of breaks down, if we look at the uniform interface, he kind of breaks it down into something that's much easier to understand and to digest and to really kind of gauge where your API is at in the maturity model. So first, we start with a swamp of POCs. We can call it POJ because that was plain old XML. Raise your hand if you are still sending XML payload responses. Come on, somebody's sending XML. All right, we're gonna call it POJ then. We're gonna go with, you're all sending JSON, right? I mean, all right, JSON. In maturity level, it's 0, but my numbered padding made it 1 because we're engineers. So in level 0, it's a post. You have one post, and HTTP is just the way that you send it. So in your post, the key on your first object might be create new user, delete user, add post. We've all seen this in some way or another. It's just a post. Your get is a post, your delete is a post, your post is a post. That's the beginning of maturing your REST endpoint. The second level is resource-based URIs, going back to accounts, invoices, UUIDs. These are the resources that you want to identify. So if you're at that next level, maybe everything's still a post, but instead of create user as the name of your object in your post, now you might just be hitting /create/user. You've matured, you've grown up just a little bit. And then if we want to grow up more, and by the way, I went through basically these phases of maturity in the application that I was working on because I had no idea what I was doing. And the next step, I was like, oh, I should probably use HTTP verbs and responses. So now everything is not a post. Now we've got gets, we've got post, we've got deletes, we've got patch, we've got put. We're not going to get into the debate on patch and put, but we've got those. And not only that, when things go correctly, we're giving the correct 200s that, yeah, this is okay, or 201s, yeah, this was created, or 400s, or 500s. We're like, yeah, I don't really know what the service did here. We're going to give you a 500, and we're going to see what happens. Let's stack trace. At this level, you've got a lot of identification inside that response. And from what I've seen, this is kind of where everyone mostly stops. Like, this is what the majority of people consider a RESTful API. Hence Roy's rant about not having hypermedia. Let's go to hypermedia as the engine of application state, HATEful. It guides the clients on how to interact with the service dynamically. Let's talk about some benefits of it, and then we're going to look at an example of it, and then we're just going to look at some code together and answer some questions and troubleshoot. Some benefits of HATEful is discoverability and evolvability. You're able to evolve your API without the beautiful thing that we all hold dear, V1, V2, V3, V4. You know, let's check it in the client to make sure they're accepting the right one. You're able to decouple the client from the server logic. You have more resilience. You align with the RESTful principles. The server can grow and morph independently. One thing that I have not gone down this route, but as we look at the transition into AI, and AI is consuming our data, the model context protocol is being developed and is coming about. It's basically a way that your endpoints and your data can talk to AI and say, like, hey, here's how the data is structured, so now you know what to do with it. And I think when you see the examples, you're going to see how that can become really powerful here. And we can also all have dumber clients. And I'm not talking about, you know, the clients that I send the invoice to. I'm talking about your phone, your laptop, the browser, wherever you're sending this data. You can make them dumber by implementing hypermedia as the engine of application state. Another quote by him on that blog post is, REST is software design on the scale of decades. Every detail is intended to promote software longevity and independent evolution. Many of the constraints are directly opposed to short-term efficiency. Unfortunately, people are fairly good at short-term design and usually awful at long-term design. Most don't think they need to design past the current release. That was written in 2008. Does that not feel like still incredibly accurate? You know, we just got to get it. We got to get the data there for this release. We got to get it shipped out. So here is an example, and it's not 100% pure. You can see the V1 in the API naming here, but this is a really common example of hypermedia as the engine of application state. You can see here in the payload you've got a links object. And in that object, you've got the relationship. This is the self. You know, this is the entity you're on. You've got the fully documented out URI to that resource. And you've also got the method for what that resource is. And this can become incredibly powerful. As I was building an application for a client and learning on the fly, I had to build access control model. Okay, we have roles permissions. It's not rocket science. You know, we'll put the permissions in the JWT, we'll check them in the client. Okay, we can show the update button or we can't show the update button. Wasn't too painful until the client says, we need a new role. We need a project manager role. And this person can update this particular entity if they're on one of the projects in this organization or this owner. Okay, so now we've got relational-based access. So how are we going to determine on the client side only if this update button should be there? It starts to get more complex. You know, you've got to pass different things in your payload to kind of determine that. So I'd like to talk through some examples here. So I just went on Figma and I found, you know, about the most generic, you know, thing I could find. We've got an e-commerce website. So I think we could walk through this and we can kind of look at some of the stuff that we probably want to return in our API response. We're going to need an array of images for this entity. We're going to need the name, how many reviews, the average review, the SKU, the price, the MSRP, the percent off, the brand, summary, tags, description, additional information. We've got customer reviews, you know, the first 3 of those. So there's a lot of data here that from a generic response like that we got to send, right? This is not a trivial thing here, especially once you start getting into related data. You know, how many vegetables are in that particular tag, those sorts of things. So if we kind of take this e-commerce page as a mental model, and we start looking at some API responses. Let me close that one out. Is that big enough? Bigger?
Sounds good.
Cool. This, to me, would be the sort of API response that I think is reasonable to expect. We've got the ID of the entity, the name, in stock, SKU, MSRP. We're gonna go down the list of all those different things. The video ID, because we're using YouTube or Vimeo, we're just gonna, hot load that in. Summaries, descriptions. We've got the images. We've got the ID of the images. The client knows where this, the structure of these URLs are. We've got the brand name, the brand ID, the tags. How many tags for each one of those? We've got the basic information on these reviews, related products. We can go through this, and this seems like a fairly reasonable response from your API. From this response, our client can build the front end, right? We can build the front end from this response. But there's a lot of out-of-band information that the client needs to know. The client needs to know, for example, what is the URL structure for getting these images? What is the URL structure for navigating to a brand? Is it /brands? Is it what did the marketing and SEO team dictate this slug be? And what will they dictate it to be later? You can go on and on through this, but then if you kind of take a look at more of a HATEful approach on this, we can kind of come back here, and I took the same one, and then I kind of commented it out. The ID, we might not need the ID, because where in a traditional response, we might need to say, okay, this is going to be /assets. Oh, come on. This is going to be /assets, images. Oh, look, it can do it for me. And this might be where that lives. And that's fine, because your front-end team knows that. They know the directory structure, where things live inside of your application. The same can be done for the brand. We can say /brands, /farmery. It goes on and on. But there is a lot of context and out-of-band information that the client has to know in order to absorb this information. If we're thinking in the MCP world, what is the AI agent going to be able to do with this information? You're giving it a lot of information. You're giving the response a lot of information, but you're not really giving it the whole story. You're giving it like the story that the people internally that have the tribal knowledge can fill in the gaps. And the whole idea of this originally from Roy is kind of like we don't need to have the out-of-band information. We don't need to have that tribal knowledge. We don't need to have those gaps in the information. So if we look at the HATEful approach, a lot of it's the same. And this wouldn't necessarily be a HATEful approach, but I think, instead of giving it image ID and having to know what that is, we can just give it the full URL. And by giving it the full URL, if the assets directory ever changes, the client doesn't have to update. If we decide to move from more traditional hosting to S3 and this URL gets really, really ugly, because they get really ugly, it doesn't matter. Nothing's going to change for the client that is consuming this data. If we go down to brand name, brand slug, brand ID, we'll come back to that. Let's go to the links. So in essence, all the places that the client can go from this specific spot should really be clearly outlined, and have the relationship there. So we can see here, we've got the self. This is the product that I am on. It's a get. If this product is not already in the cart, or if it's not in stock, or if it is in stock, we're going to provide the add to cart URL endpoint, and we're going to say that it's going to be a post. And the beauty of this is when that page is loaded, if that item's already in the cart or the item's out of stock, we're just not going to pass the add to cart link to the client. And all the client has to really do is, like I use Vue, all you do is a vif add to cart. It's pretty simple. The same can kind of go for favorites and for reviews. Like all of this stuff, the client would have to have the context. I don't know why that keeps happening. Would have to have the context of, we're going to need a slash reviews after the UUID of this product, but it's going to start with products. Anytime that stuff changes, that means you're coupled. That's coupling that you can remove. Because I don't know about you guys, for me, with my clients, sometimes the domain changes. And sometimes SEO experts get involved and they want to change the directory structure and they want it to be prettier and they want Google to like it more. So with this approach, you're able to change your service and change your API response without having to update your clients. And you can just really keep making your clients dumber and dumber and dumber. And so let's go back to kind of looking at some of this stuff that's kind of coming out here. Related products and reviews and brand. One of the HATeful adjacent kind of approaches is kind of to say like, all this stuff is embedded. This is not the core entity data. It's clear that it wants the core entity data to be the core entity data. But everything outside of that, would generally kind of be put under like an embedded object inside of that. So we could say, so embedded in this product is the brand. This product is related to this brand, and here's everything you need to know about the brand. And as you work your way through these related entities, each of those has its own hypermedia as the engine of application state links inside of it. A good example, I think, is down to the related products. So if we go down to related products here, it's got its own hypermedia section, because if we go back and look at this mock-up, you can see in the client side here, when you hover over one of these product images, you've got actions. You can put it right in the cart, you can view it, or you can add as a favorite without going to that entity, without calling another endpoint and going there. So all of those things should be well-defined inside of the hypermedia for that particular embedded object. So I've had some really good outcomes with this, especially, like I said, around access control and providing stuff from the service to the client. I like to joke, in the applications that I've been building, it's you give me actions, I give you buttons. No actions, no buttons. And it really gets that easy because you can update the access control in the back end and let all that code run, and you're just going to get the correct responses to the correct places. Obviously, you have to have all of your authorization on the back end. That's a concern. You should have that in place. But I found myself having to repeat logic in the client that is in the back end as well, just to get the client to render correctly. So that's HATeful. I'd love to talk about it, ask some questions, point out the stuff that I did wrong here. Because again, this is all new to me, and as I went down that rabbit hole, no one was using hypermedia as the engine of application state, and it seems very sensical to me. I've got a lot of friends that are developers that are really good, and they're like, I've never heard of that in my life. But you can see here how easy you can make it to transform your API responses and transform your client, really. Yep.
Yeah, I've been building where the idea is in a runtime like Nano, when you do your relative imports, you just give it a qualified URL, right? And so even the code dependencies themselves are taking advantage of the beautiful thing that is the URL. It holds a lot of stuff in it because you've encapsulated another protocol in it, right?
Yeah.
So this totally makes sense, to give the data object more context, because a browser can use, right? You're just talking what the browser can use.
Yeah, and when Roy talks about hypertext as HATeful, he talks about it as the client consuming it, not as a user consuming it. And this was in the year 2000. It's very intriguing that we're now coming into this time of AI and protocols like the MCP. It's that's kind of like what he was talking about is how do we make it so easily consumable that anything can read it? There is no defined standard, like it doesn't have to be underscore links, like PayPal used links. GitHub, I had an example of it in my Figma file. GitHub puts it in the main response, but everything that is kind of the hypermedia is appended with underscore URL. So it's still doing that same thing. It's like, this is the place to go to get or do this thing. You don't have to figure out all the other parts of the URI to be able to get there. Like, let's just be explicit with it. Yeah.
Does the MCP, protocol or whatever, allow for those conditional actions, like what you're talking about with the add to cart or save or whatever?
With the what?
Does the MCP standard allow for conditional actions like the add to cart or save, like based on what the AI agent's already done or what you've done?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I'm not well versed in AI. I just know that the MCP is something that's being developed, and I know it's a machine consuming data, and if we can say, here is the place to go do those other things and get those other pieces of data, I think that's going to be valuable versus having to say, like, I have a product ID. Okay, what is your product endpoint? And some of the reasons that kind of hypermedia hasn't really caught on is because we use versioning in the APIs, which Roy has very strong feelings on, by the way. But then we also, increase documentation of APIs, which is great. But what if the information just came with the response? So that's kind of the idea, is like, let's make it consumable by anything.
So it does. Speaking on the MCP servers.
Yes, please.
Part of the protocol is a list of tools, and so whenever you call list tools, you get a list of the tools that are on the server with a name, description, and parameters that the agent will have to send in. So it's very much synonymous with the HATEOS you're talking about, where you wouldn't have it be one or two. If you change the tools internally within the server, the next time you call those tools, you get a different place. So therefore, as long as you keep that up, you do that with tools call each time, you stay up.
And you can take this, like in mine, I take it kind of to the next level, so like, I might say something like, the title is add to cart. For me, that is further it's not really changing the coupling, anymore, but it is allowing me to make the client dumber, which I'm a big fan of, making the client as dumb as possible. So, you can kind of take this and morph it and make it work for whatever it is you need. There's not like, no one's going to scold you if, you have an extra title prop on that object. Yeah.
So, very much on the same page with making APIs more easily mapped. First off, this was more accessible and easier to use for everyone. Doesn't that include bad actors? Right?
Yes, it does.
Like, for instance, having easily accessible maps is one thing, but having it turned on every single API call that's just always available to the client, that feels like it might be a bit much.
Yeah, so there's a good talk online where they had a kind of security spin on this, and they were taking and kind of creating some encrypted, 64 character things and adding to the end and kind of like saying, are you coming from the right place? My perspective on it is, I don't trust the client. I just don't trust the client. But we're creating these React front ends and these Vue front ends and name your framework. All those endpoints are in the code. If they just decompile, those endpoints are in your code. So to me, when you download that initial JavaScript file, you actually gave them all the endpoints already. So I don't really see it being any different from a security standpoint, because you still have to have all of your authentication and authorization and everything on the back end. I knew someone was going to ask that, because yes, you could fuzz it more easily to say like, oh, I can delete an account or I can do these things, but your front end code has it. It's already in the JavaScript.
But it's not in one place easily mapped, found,
Yeah, no, it's a valid. I mean, and then like I said, there's ways you can you can add pseudo state to it, you know, which goes against one of the core principles. For me, like if a bad actor is trying to get into your web app or your service, they're gonna try, like if they really want to get in, they're gonna decompile. I mean, I bet I've never done it, but I bet I could in 5 minutes figure out how to decompile a React front end. You know, like certainly there's tools that do that and provide all the endpoints.
I guess one thing you can do with that is you don't get the API of the
No.
layer itself, and there's a wrapper where you internally use your own, purposes, whatever, so you can add in a layer of security between the API and your actual code calls.
Have it, but I don't know, it just sits wrong, just having a map, feels. I think I'm not even saying that that's necessarily correct.
Yeah, I guess the way I'm seeing it is you can view the actual API that you put out as public, and so like you expect it to be public, and you expect anything that's coming back from it to potentially be compromised, and so therefore you take care of the security on the layer between the RPC and the API that you present.
But we're not actually returning anything that the user shouldn't have access to, right? If the user doesn't have the ability to add something to the cart, shouldn't we be removing that element from the links being?
Yeah, that like so if the user that going back to the access control example that I talked about, if the user doesn't have the ability to update that entity, they won't get the path to update that entity. But if they're on the front end and they have the access to do that, and you're not using HATEful, they do have the path to that URL, to that endpoint. So I think I just have no trust for the client, and I know that we already are embedding all of these endpoints and URIs in the front end, and we're saying even easier now, download them all in one file. You don't have to go search our application. They're all in one JavaScript file when you open it up. All you gotta do is decompose it. So I mean, I felt the same way. Like it's easy. It's gonna be very easy to fuzz. You just kind of go through it, but like kind of he said, you gotta. I already assume that they're bad actors trying to hit it, so you got to make sure you have your access control and your JWTs and all that stuff in place, before you even start looking for data to send it back.
I would actually think, kind of what you were saying earlier about, I think that's one example of like, here's the UID, but there's tribal knowledge, it's implicit, to take that UID and then stick it somewhere in another URL. I would actually think that this being more explicit would actually be potentially more secure, easier to catch things in responses for the end user to not have access, right? Like I would think, hopefully that would get taught pre-release easier than if, oh look, there's an extra prop of a UID, but maybe my scanners don't pick that up as something that poses a potential vulnerability.
Yeah, from my perspective, and again, I've been doing this for a whopping 16 months, like I don't think that it changes the security layer, really. If you've got someone in a terminal hitting your endpoint, then yes, you are surfacing it up easier, but you are also embedding all these endpoints in a JavaScript file, generally, in 2025.
Yeah, it does seem more secure to me now, just because, like, if you've got a pre-compiled JavaScript file with all the endpoints, then it tells you how to do all kinds of things that you don't have access to. It tells you the endpoints for everything, whereas this, you still have to get permission to do the thing before you can see what the endpoint is.
Yeah. Any more thoughts, questions?
I'd like to add to Paul's point earlier that originally, back in the day, before JavaScript modules were a thing, JavaScript dependencies were all expressed as URLs.
So when we have this client-server relationship, I love REST, and that's like my main thing, right? And thinking about resources as user/new or like :ID post /:ID. Like I think that way now, and it's cool. But every once in a while, I get pushback from like what SOAP was and what GraphQL is now, and whatever MCP will become. to kind of like know ahead of time what you're asking for, and then with SOAP or an MCP or GraphQL, you don't know what you're asking for ahead of time. And then the front end, the client, does take on more compute, but like they have more agency to ask for a range of things from the server. So I don't know if you've had to wrestle with that. Like there's the concreteness of REST, like, the constancy of it versus something like SOAP or GraphQL.
Yeah, and those may not be RESTful APIs. You know, going back to the definition of it. I mean, has anyone here ever put hypermedia like this in their response? You have? Then Roy Felding will be very happy to hear that. You know, but he made it very clear how he felt about not having hypermedia. That was kind of it is one of the core constraints. It wasn't thank God, the optional code, you know, sending code on demand. Thankfully that was optional. You know, so as he worked through this, that seemed really important to him. And for those of you who don't know who he is, I mean, he helped write the spec on HTTP 1, HTTP 1.1. I mean, he's kind of one of those like old school OG internet people. You know, he's not just like pull this out of his butt.
I've definitely never seen it like this, so thank you for sharing this. The only thing I've seen is like the JSON API spec, so like it might have like the next and previous, like you're paginating or something like that. But yeah, this is way more in depth for sure.
Yeah, the JSON API spec is not dissimilar, because like if you had a table on this page, you know, you would send your next page, you would send your previous page, you'd send your 1, 2, you know, your ... in the middle, your 9, 10, you know, those would be a part of this links hypermedia portion of it, because those are the places, those are the state transitions that the client can make within the application. So they would fall right in this list.
You know, I wouldn't count out stream and executable code from the server again, because with WebAssembly, you can have a WebAssembly runtime on the front end with like little containers of runtime, and then from the server, you just start streaming in binary executable data in the native like C++ or whatever for the efficiency. As soon as it hits the WASM layer, it's recompiled and executed like in the browser. So, dude, we just do it again. Yeah. Depends, like, if you really want to crunch some numbers, you're gonna need the specificity of a C++.
Yeah.
Yeah, so why don't we just put another server inside that can reinterpret itself along the way?
Yep.
Anyone else? Questions? I would love questions. I want to learn more about this. I want to see, you know, how far we can push this and what we can do with it. Does it spark any ideas for anybody? I hope so. I found it very interesting to kind of go down and learn that maturity model and learn how bad of a person I was by not using HTTP verbs and responses. And, you know, for me, it was a good scolding. Yeah.
What exactly is hypermedia?
Ooh. And we're out of time. so that it's been, even Roy kind of states somewhere that like it's kind of morphed. The relationship that's established between the client and the service of like these are the media types that I'm going to send you. I think the most common type is going to be a hyperlink. You know, we can all think through that, but I mean, you know, when you send an HTML response instead of a JSON response, like that's got all the hypermedia in it that you need to render the user interface. You know, like one of the core reasons for doing this from him, I don't know if I included that quote, but you know, it's basically like to completely separate the user interface needs from the back end, from the service. And I think this can get us one step closer to that. Anyone else?
Yeah, one more quick question. We were talking about like not versioning. You know, this might open the door for you to not version your API.
Where's his come on. This is how he feels about versioning. Because the whole point is it should be able to evolve. That the hypermedia, it doesn't have to be just links. Whatever's in the hypermedia should be driving you from one place to the other. You shouldn't really have to version because you've added a value to your main entity object. That doesn't justify a version of your API, but we all know that when you change all the URI structures of your endpoints, we got a version, so that way we know. It used to be /v1/products, and now it's v1/consumer products, because SEO team always wins. So I'm not sure I think versioning your API is going to depend on, how you evolve it is going to depend on your application. But he obviously has some strong feelings on that in 2013, which is, I think it's funny, like every few years he pops up and he's still annoyed.
I think there's kind of pros and cons to each approach. There's something to be said about having a declarative contract. It's you can think of it as kind of the same thing with JavaScript versus TypeScript, right? Sometimes it's good to have that declarative. This is V1. This is how it is. Especially whenever you're working with multiple themes on something, then you have the power of on the other side you have the power of dynamically being able to describe the API from in the response phase.
Yeah.
It's literally an interface, and you just hide that complexity on the back end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When it comes to sending snippets of HTML in hypermedia responses, doesn't that have the issue that any mobile app or desktop application using the API won't be able to actually use that snippet without introducing a web view or something similar?
When I say sending HTML, in your content headers, I'm saying hey, this is going to be a JSON response. But if you just go to a web page, the initial response is going to be generally an HTML response. So I wouldn't send HTML as code on demand.
I see. There's large HTML string in the JSON example you had, where I got that impression.
Oh, is there there's HTML in the response.
Yes.
That's pretty normal.
Yeah.
If you ever have to touch the WordPress REST API, this would be tame. Compared to that, you're gonna see a whole lot of what do they do? Everything's in a comment. This is a WP that you're gonna see that, and then you just you have to, whatever your front end framework is, you have to reparse that to HTML.
Server-side rendering is literally just sending the HTML string from the server to
No.
the browser.
I'm talking about something that isn't a browser.
Something that isn't a browser.
Yeah, having a UI that isn't a browser.
Yes.
You then have to wrap that in a web view, and you have to do it seamlessly enough that it seems like it'd be a bit of a pain.
It is a pain. Dealing with HTML in a native context is very challenging, but it's also something that you tend to encounter a lot just because ultimately this is coming from a CMS that's going to be generating HTML on the fly. So you either clean it up on the server side or you have to deal with a lot of nasty Swift, Kotlin, or JavaScript.
Would this have accessibility implications if you're returning HTML in there?
I'm sorry, what?
Would it have accessibility implications if you return HTML?
In a native context?
Well, just if the context is let's say it's got paragraph tags and bold tags and stuff like that. If somebody's using a screen reader or something like that, then doesn't that make it a little bit harder to give them the information?
Well, the screen reader wouldn't be reading the API response. The screen reader would be reading what the client renders. So I use views. In Vue, there's a v-HTML, and any data you pass into that, it'll take this description and it'll make paragraph tags for you. It'll do that conversion for you. So, screen readers wouldn't be reading this. This would be what your front end, your client would receive, and then your client has to transpose it to the right elements.
It's a rendering question. Where is it?
Yeah, it's a rendering.
Yeah, to that point, in native, what you would do is you would essentially do a fancy string replacement around this and generate different types of components around it. But there are accessibility controls or accessibility functionality in native, but you just have to make sure that you're accounting for that when you're making that conversion.
Cool. Well, thank you guys for having such a great discussion. I'm hoping that it prompts you guys to look more into hypermedia as the engine of application state and kind of think through more of what you are providing, from your API responses to the client, and seeing if there's ways that you can further decouple those. Because I think as you decouple them, the world of possibilities opens up.